So we're going to do now the second AMA on the next prioritization working group. Second being this is a good time for those in parts of Americas and also Asia Pacific. We had a really good discussion this morning with quite a few people in attendance in the AMA, which is great. And if you haven't reviewed the notes on that or watched the recording, I would encourage you to do so. For this one, right now we have one question, and it's to start, and it's from Elliot, who couldn't join the call, so I'll verbalize Elliot's question. How are we planning on measuring percentage of output? For example, in steady state, bugs are 10% of a team's output. Is that 10% the number of issues, of MRs, or some other standardized weighting process? And Mech, it looks like you already have a thought on that.
Yeah, I can take this for the chart. So we don't have a complicated weighting mechanism on issues or anything like that. We are showing the amount of MRs merged from that team and categorizing it by bugs, features, and maintenance. So the 10% steady state that Elliot mentioned is of the MRs merged, 10% of them, the ratio should be bug fixes. That's the steady state. It all will depend on the backlog of each teams. So it may be above 10% depending on how big your backlog of bug is and how work is being prioritized for that team.
Thanks, Mick.
Sure.
I don't have anything to add to that. Cheryl, looks like you have the next question.
Sure, thanks, Wayne. I was going to ask if you could clarify what is considered to be maintenance. I think on the working group page, it mentions ENs would be DRIs for this. It sounds like anything that used to qualify under, say, an engineering allocation could be maintenance.
Yeah, we have this in the handbook, and we can always make it clear what is clarified as maintenance. So things that were previously under infra dev, things that were previously under engineering allocation. So restructuring for stability in the long term, how we CI decomposition, for example, we're moving the code around so we can scale. There's also the UX debt that's part of it. There's workflows, enhancements, in internal productivity changes. So things that are not directly things that are internal to us, and it's not resulting in a feature enhancement or a new feature addition. And it is in the handbook. I'll link it in a second. We have it. We have the types categorized.
Mech, I just did. Hopefully that's the right page.
Yes, that is correct. Thank you.
Yep, definitely.
We had about 50 people come this morning, and we have about 8 today. Any other questions from the group or things relating to this working group or what we're trying to accomplish that anyone would like to discuss?
Do we actually want to circle back to that first question? I had a thought. So Mech, I like your answer. It's MR, the count of MRs is what our measuring will. But that's assuming that the relative sizing, we're all thinking like one MR versus another MR are kind of the same scale. And I think that actually goes back into our iteration philosophy or value quite well. Keep things small. So if teams are ending up with MRs that are rather large and MRs that are really small, it's going to outweigh in areas unintentionally or intentionally. I don't know if people have more thoughts on that, but that's where my mind was at. Cool.
We were saying if we break things down, the ratio of those types will be higher because we have more MRs. I'm
thinking as long as our MRs, the amount of work, the complexity or level of effort, either one in an MR is similar to each other, then this metric works out just fine, the measurability across types. But if you did have teams that were, not consistent in how we're breaking the work down, and therefore some MRs could be large, some are super small, then those metrics are going to be off because of that. So I think that what I'm saying is this encourages our iteration philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's right, Neil. Like I think when we did the MR8 working group or the engineering productivity working group a couple of years ago at this point, we did some analysis of this. Mac, you remember this, but I think we found like our average MR was like 70 or 80 lines of code. It was fairly standard. In other words, it felt like through the effort of making things small, we accidentally encountered this kind of like lower limit on a change that was fairly uniform. There's obviously some variability about that. Some are one-liners and some are more, but it seemed to be pretty standardized. And some people, when we talk about MR8 as a productivity concept, some people are like, well, I'll just break things up into smaller items and ship them and game the MR8 thing. We said, great, do that. we love you gaming MR8 that way, because making things smaller is a proven way to manage complexity. So it's actually kind of like an anti-fragile aspect of MR8. And I agree with you. If these metrics and stuff, they don't dictate decisions, but when we see outliers, we'll ask questions, and that might be one of the answers of like, oh yeah, this team could do a better job of work breakdown, and probably approach that kind of lower limit other teams have found, and their numbers would change, hopefully improve, and then all is right with the world. And that's actually an easier to solve than many other things that could be going wrong if a team finds themselves at one end of the bell curve compared to other teams. But like there's other examples. So like we found, MR8 dipped a little bit, let's say over the past 6 months. And part of analysis Christopher and I did showed that, and I think the engineering analytics team and Mac, we found that like it was because we did a preponderance of security issues, and they tend to be more complex and require more testing. And so our MR8 dropped. And now as we were almost down, bringing down the past 2 security issues, we're starting to see MR lift again. So again, kind of confirm that hypothesis. So there's a team that, is a little bit off compared to other teams. We look at it and say like, oh, they're doing a bunch of security stuff. We're going to say that makes sense. Don't change what you're doing. And maybe we just change the proportion of bug MRs or something to fit what they're doing correctly. And that's the key, is that like at the end of the numbers, they need to also coincide with reality. And what feels right. Like, are we doing the right stuff? Does it feel right? Do the numbers make sense? Okay, it's good that these 2 things match each other. If the numbers are good, but everything is bad about the area of the code that team's working on, we're not going to say, well, the numbers are good, so we're not going to change anything here. We'll change the numbers. And that'll be a conversation. We'll do that in partnership with PM.
I think it was
you put some more comments in number 2. Do you want to verbalize those?
Sure, thanks. So I think there was the development metrics working group. There was a few years back. If we need info, we can reach back in to that. I wanted to vocalize B. So I did take a brief look at the current handbook state, and we don't have any mentions around restructuring for stability in the future. So I'll make an update to the MR, and Chair, I'll tag you for review, and we'll do a recap in the working group tomorrow on that iteration to make it clear.
Thanks, Mike.
Taylor, thanks for adding a question. You want to verbalize?
Yeah, so I'm curious if you see this really as a formalization of trying to get EMs and PMs on the same page. I mean, maybe I'm just lucky and I've had a great EM in my entire time at GitLab, and we've worked together to coordinate and negotiate what we were prioritizing of bug fixes, technical debt, new features. Is this more of a way to make sure that that's happening at scale across GitLab?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it, Taylor. That's definitely one of the elements. Think of it like a bell curve, right? There's some teams where we'll put this in place. They're already doing mostly right things, and will feel like a lot of work for very little change. So we want those teams to kind of understand the benefit of consistency, because I think most teams are in the middle of that bell curve, and there'll be a moderate change. And there'll be some teams at the opposite end of that bell curve that it's a radical change to what they were prioritizing. And so for those of you that are adopting something, it feels like, well, this isn't really changing anything, just trust that like it's for the benefit of the broader consistency. And to some extent, we'll ask you to make sure what you're doing right is formalized in the system, and then teach that to other groups that need to affect change based on the results that they're getting. So we'll try to enroll you in rolling this out. And hopefully it's not a large amount of overhead, because we want to keep our processes as minimal as possible. Now, that being said, I've never in my career gone from a situation where I had no metrics for something and was using entirely instincts to having metrics. It didn't change something about what I was doing. So even EMs and PMs that are getting good results, that feel pretty good about what's going on, I'd be open to like seeing something in there. It's like, oh wow, we were blind to this thing going on there, and we need to prioritize more observability or usability or security issues or whatever it is. Like we can always optimize what we're doing with metrics, and so I expect it to be beneficial to varying extents for everybody.
And then as a follow-up to this question, I know that there's changes to labels and how we track some of these different types of workflows or workloads. I assume on the back end, there's likely additional opportunities for GitLab to claim R&D tax credits based on the type of work that we're doing. Is that also happening in the background here?
Not as a function of the working group, but yeah, it's definitely a worthy goal to do the right things so we can do those R&D tax incentives, and we are doing those things.
It is happening on the back end, Taylor. We consolidate the types. If you recall, last year there were like 10 types of labels that were used. When we report from a finance perspective, the industry standard scheme is bugs, features, and maintenance. So having a clear definition and an accurate way of classifying the type of the work that goes in helps. And the finance team is looking at the reports of merged MRs and with these types and then subtypes.
Okay, but we're not using that to drive what these values are across different teams.
What do you mean by driving?
Try
these
to like optimize tax benefits or whatever other credits or things like.
I can't speak to that. I can't speak to that, but I know that the finance team is looking at our overall MR output and then mapping it to these new types that we have consolidated.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we've hit the end of the questions we had in advance. Since we're quite good on time, anything else people want to ask about the working group? Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.